And gentlemen, and welcome to the second edition of the SBS webinar series, Navigating the Pandemic. Today's topic is budgeting in crisis, revisiting the principles of budgeting for an organization in time of crisis. When you check the dailies, I was checking the newspapers, and the first article that went out about the impact of the pandemic that we are facing on our NSC on 16th March mentioned that the NSC total market capitalization has shrunk by 120 billion, that being one of the largest declines in a one single day in the history of NSC. If you look at the data out there, the global cost of the virus has been ranging somewhere around 43 billion US dollars. There's been a lot of disrupted supply chains, tourism, agriculture, and horticulture exports, sectors that are relying on imported raw products, such as manufacturing. And of course, this has impacted the revenues that we were expecting for the businesses. And as such, we need to reconsider our budgeting because we had not budgeted with this in mind. And so today, to take us through this particular session, we have Mr. Geoffrey Injeni. The session is structured in two parts, where we have 35 minutes with the faculty sharing his insights on the topic, and we have 25 minutes for Q&A. So I'd like to welcome Mr. Geoffrey Injeni, who is a faculty and a consultant in accounting and finance at Strathmore University Business School. Karibu sana, Geoffrey.
Right, Eda, thank you very much. And I'm honored to be discussing a very important subject for many organizations, and also in this period where we have COVID. And one of the things that really, motivates me in terms of discussing this topic is that we have two professors from Harvard, Fraser and Hope, who began a movement called Beyond Budgeting. And what they've done is that they encourage companies to stop relying too much on the budget. And this is because the traditional way of doing budgeting, the authors feel that is not relevant. Although research has shown that many organizations really believe a lot in the budget. And of course, I have a quote, from the two authors. They've written a fantastic book called Beyond Budgeting. So for those of us who wish to maybe make further reference, can actually check what they're proposing. But all in all, they're saying the traditional way of doing budgeting does not help us to cope with a complex environment, which changes all the time. And in fact, with COVID now, we can see the turbulence that arises. And if we keep on doing budgeting the way we do, then we will not be able to respond and even achieve what we've set out in our strategy. So on the screen, I've also shared what they're saying here. Most organizations are still doing traditional budgets, but on the other side, the authors are very extreme. They're saying that we don't need to do budgets. We need to think beyond budgeting. So they're proposing a radical move of removing budgets completely. But quite a number of companies and organizations have realized that it's better to improve budgets. So we're trying to look at better ways of doing budgets, and some are moving towards beyond budgeting by doing advanced budgeting here. So the purpose of this session today will be to basically, take you back to what a traditional way of looking at budgeting is, by briefly looking at what a budget is and the definition, and see whether it's still relevant. And a critical one is the approaches to budgeting and the budgeting process. And of course, we'll wrap it up with the types of budgets and the terms and conclusion. But all this will be discussed in light of the COVID and also what changes we can make and some approaches that we can actually apply when we have a crisis. But all in all, at the end of the day, we also have a conclusion regarding why the budget cannot be solely the tool that will help us deal with the pandemic. So just to start here, we look at what the budgeting is. And of course, for most of us who are involved from the top leadership and budget implementation, we say that the budget is just a very popular tool that helps us to implement the plan. So what you do is that you have your strategy. Maybe it could be for the next 5 years. Of course, people are even questioning whether we should be doing a strategy for 5 years now. Probably we need to have an annual strategy because of the dynamic nature. But once you have your 5-year budget, strategy, for example, then the idea is to have a plan, an annual plan, from which you basically use tools like a budget to implement the same. So in this case, your budget will be, your plan, but now you've expressed this in monetary terms. So how much you're going to spend. And this also means that when you look at the crisis that we have, that will mean that traditionally most of our plans have always considered the situation where things will turn out as expected, or we sometimes expect history to repeat itself. And of course, again, the question then will be, do you need several plans? And therefore, do you need several budgets for that case? So in this case, the authors like Fraser and Hope, together with other proponents of beyond budgeting, feel that you probably will need a plan that is quite flexible, that looks at so many other scenarios, where you can also prepare for disaster. Now, again, if you look at what a budget does for us, you'll find that all this is tied to the strategy and the planning. So, we have been looking at a budget to enable us also just to plan. For example, once you know how much you're going to spend, then you plan on how to raise the monies. And of course, you're going to see the types of budgets that apply. But from a strategy perspective, you have your budget that helps you to know where you're going to get the money from and how you're going to spend your resources. A budget is also used as a tool for communication because now you will bring in all the relevant parties to implement the plans, from the CEO or the head of, or the leader of the organization, all the way to the line managers and also to your staff, on what are the plans in terms of revenues and expenditures. Traditional authors in terms of budget also believe that a budget is used as a tool to motivate staff. So for example, if you talk about increases in their benefits, and of course for marketers also revenue targets, they may work hard actually to get to the targets. And once you know how much you're going to make and where you're going to spend in terms of resource allocation, then you'll be able to coordinate the activities of the organization. And of course, this is very important because each department or function of the organization knows how much is required or what needs to be done. And of course, the resources allocated. Definitely, we know that in terms of budgeting, once you do your annual budget, most organizations actually break this down into some periods. So you have maybe quarterly budgets, which you can then prepare other reports, management reports, including financial statements, and you can compare between what is happening in the first quarter and vis-a-vis what should have been done or what should have been achieved given the budget. And here you're able to find out the difference between the actual and the budget, which is called variance. And that variance will now tell us whether we're able to achieve the budgets. Definitely, given the kind of situation we are faced now, many organizations will have a challenge in terms of being able to achieve a lot in their first quarter because again of the crisis that we're in. But a traditional budget will help us to take corrective action in case we discover that we have problems there. And of course, most organizations will use a budget as one of the tools to evaluate performance. We all know for marketers, the question is, did we meet our targets? And for those who are in charge of cost centers, the HR, finance, IT, who don't bring in revenue, the question is that did we run our departments within the budget? So looking at this role, at the moment when there's a crisis, there's potential for us to, check again how the budget may help us manage the current crisis that we have. Probably now, in terms of planning, we might be in trouble. But of course, we're going to see some of the approaches to budgeting that may help us deal with certain eventualities. From the concepts of beyond budgeting, the idea is you need to have 2 or 3 or 4, even 5, or even many other plans and several types of budgets that gives you different types of scenarios. And of course, if there's going to be an effect on your revenues, then probably in terms of communication, that would be very important. As to whether people will be motivated, COVID or the crisis usually could be a counter. But again, if you're still operating within the budget, then you can still be motivated there. So I think when there's a crisis, the budget will still achieve a majority of these, roles. The only thing is that we will have to do quite a number of them in light of the crisis that we are facing. But in addition to retaining the role of the budget during the crisis, I think at the moment, traditional budgetists will still agree that the budget will still play a very important role in achieving these 6 items. We'll still have to plan, we still have to do the communication, and despite the fact that we have challenges in terms of incurring cost and revenue, we still have to motivate our staff and, of course, continue to coordinate activities. Probably in terms of evaluating performance, that might be a question, but again, as long as you're able to explain the problem, then there should be really not a big challenge here. So in addition to the role of budget, the proponents of beyond budgeting argue that there are certain approaches that we can still use to manage our budgeting process and even ensure that we are still, we're still not caught up with the problems that arise in budgets. So, for example, if we look at the 4 critical approaches of budgeting, the basic one is a traditional budgeting, where most organizations refer to previous periods figures, and then they make some adjustments in light of new plans, or maybe based on what happened in history. So usually for most organizations, the idea is that what were figures for last year and what adjustments we need in order for us to reflect the reality of the ground. Now, unfortunately, proponents of beyond budgeting feel that relying so much on historical figures does not prepare you well for realities that come in life. So, for example, these fellows will be celebrating now to say that if you spent about 4 months last year doing the budget, you'll find that all your efforts really are not worth it. And currently, then they will propose, zero-based budgeting, which is also an extreme approach to budgeting, where each and every expenditure item is questioned before the figure is actually included in the budget. So in terms of maybe crises that an organization will face at the moment, even though traditional budgeting will help you with certain figures, because certain costs, for example, like employee benefits and costs to deliver products to your customers may not change substantially. The additional costs that you may have to start asking whether they are justified. So zero-based budgeting is simply asking, if we start from scratch, should we include this expenditure here? So we're not going to incur any expenditure here unless it is substantially justified. Of course, traditional budgeting and zero-based budgeting are extreme approaches to budgeting. And you may have some slight variations in terms of activities that you may have to conduct. So, for example, a number of authors also propose doing a budget for activities or specific programs. And I think if you change, say, your strategies, like you're going to mention as one of the last items, probably your strategy, if you're to design or come up with any new program or activity or product in light of a crisis that you're faced with, then probably an activity-based budget will be very important or applicable on your case. But at the same time, if you feel that some of your historical figures are not substantially reliable, then a rolling budget will probably help you. Example, operations have been substantially curtailed. A rolling budget think about what really happened in January and use that as the basis of your budget for February. A number of authors who feel that traditional way of doing budgets should be done with actually advocate for a rolling budget, where a rolling budget is closer to reality than a traditional way of doing budgets. But all in all, looking at those 4 approaches to budgeting, I don't think we can dismiss all of them entirely. Traditional budgeting, where you use historical figures, will still be applicable, because some figures will still apply. But definitely the question is whether these figures are still justifiable. So are certain expenditure items really applicable? If you initiate any new program in light of the crisis, then program-based budget will be more relevant. But again, if you feel that some of the data you have in terms of historical data, then if that data is not really applicable, then rolling budget in that case will really apply. So I think what stands out very well here, it's zero-based budget, just to question some of the figures from the historical figures from traditional budgeting. New products and new programs or new activities will require separate budgets. And of course, a rolling budget will help you to come closer to reality. So a rolling budget here will really help when you have a crisis like COVID. So in terms of the different stages, when there's a crisis, I think the first stage is just to communicate the budget details. Each department may have to be involved in terms of budget preparation. And then negotiation of budget. Sometimes if you have a crisis, then that may take less time because when there's a crisis, then probably negotiation takes less time as compared to the traditional way. Coordination and review, and of course approval will still be required. So as we head towards the concluding aspects for this webinar, a very important question then is, are the different types of budgets in the organization still relevant? Definitely, the guys of sales and marketing may have their revenues impacted. So are we going to generate enough revenue? How much expenses are we going to incur? This is something that will still be applicable. And probably you'll have to rerun quite a number of marketing activities there. If you're providing essential services, for example, for those organizations that operate a factory, then what level of inventory should you have? That may require probably to move to different approaches to managing inventory levels. The goods that you're going to manufacture, maybe your capacity may be affected. Availability of materials, for example, importing, if you have staff who need to work there and other kind of expenditures, this may actually take a hit, and probably you'll need to break it down again, going back to the zero-based budgeting to see what are your priority items. In terms of purchasing materials and others, this will also be affected depending on the capacity and availability of the various the supply chain that you have. Of course, many other budget items will be affected in terms of your incomes that you expect to incur. The funny thing about life here is that whereas your revenues may get a significant hit, you'll find that operational expenses will still be incurred, especially if they are committed. And of course, you also have other types of budgets. Most likely your profit or loss budget will also be slightly hit, where you have your revenues may reduce significantly, but your operational costs may not reduce so much. Definitely your cash receipts and payments will also be affected. Quite a number of customers may not be able to pay, so your cash budget will also be impacted here negatively. And when you have a crisis, most likely capital expenditure items, land buildings and other long-term assets may not be a priority for you. So in that case, again, you may still retain the types of budgets that you need to undertake here, but the focus now will be on priority items from your budgets there. Definitely many of these items, some of them are income, some of them are expenses. A discussion will need to, will have to be taken up in terms of the historical costs that will arise. And then of course, in terms of, how frequent you can do the budget, quite a number of organizations do the annual budget, and this is actually the usual practice because most of our plans are annual, but definitely when there's a crisis, then the frequency of budgets becomes important. So, you could still break it down into monthly or quarterly budgets. But again, this time, the time frame for managing your crisis will require budgets to be done slightly earlier. We've already talked about specific programs. If you're in a position to get some more money, you can also do a supplementary budget. And then, of course, you'll also have, the different types of expenditures. And when we have a crisis, a recurrent expenditure, basically, these will be operational expenditures that, organizations incur And these are terms that are more common in the government or public sector. So for example, the government will still have to pay, for essential services, but then the construction of bridges and roads and the like will need to be deferred. This is basically given in from the development of capital expenditure budget. And then by flexibility, this is where traditional budget is lagging behind, because you'll find that most organizations prepare what is called a static budget. So a static budget talks about just one scenario, but a flexible budget will consider many other scenarios. This time, you're saying, okay, let's assume that there's COVID next year. Of course, that one, nobody anticipated that COVID will hit us so bad in 2020. But now, moving forward, these are the scenarios that you need to really be thinking about. So you have some kind of modeling. And then, of course, you can have a combined budget of departmental ones. So basically, when there's a bit of a crisis, then you might think of doing your budgets more frequently, more specific, and then focus on more of operating expenditure. You may want to look at many options and also more of a separated budget rather than a master budget. So just to wrap it up then, and maybe to answer a few questions here. The beyond budgeting authors here on strategies believe that if you're to run a successful budget, then a good budget or even the budgeting process is not a substitute for, say, poor strategy and planning. And that means that you will have to supplement your budget with what are the strategic initiatives that you have in place. So when there's a crisis, how adaptive or how adaptable are you? Please remember that in terms of linking your budget to strategy, usually you'll have your strategic objectives or pillars, and then each pillar will have some measurement and then the targets that you need to achieve, and then come up with initiatives that will help you to meet the targets. And of course, then you prepare your budget. So your budget will basically try to put the costs or the numbers to your initiatives. So having said that, I think the clear message is try to be very strategic and adaptive to crises, and that will be reflected in your budget process.
Okay, thank you so much, Geoffrey. We appreciate your time and we appreciate the input. I would like to encourage us to note any questions that you have. We have 3 questions and we'll ask them. So in case you have any question, kindly note it on the chat and we'll pick it up and answer. I think to start, Geoffrey, my first question is, you mentioned different approaches to budgeting. I'm just wondering, in a crisis like we are in, how agile can a budget be?
Yeah, so if you just do a bit of research, what the beyond budgeting proponents suggest is that they're using the crisis that we are faced with now to justify the, doing away with traditional budgeting. And they say that currently most innovative and agile organizations do not operate with a budget. And a few case studies have been done to see how organizations operate without a budget. But the idea is that it's not always an issue of sticking to or trying to criticize maybe a certain way of doing a budget. As I said here, most organizations prefer to improve their budgets. So for example, we've talked about traditional budgeting here, saying we rely on historical ways of figures. Now, when you're faced with a crisis, then it means that a very good approach to adopting or dealing with a crisis is to say use a program-based budget or even a rolling budget. So a rolling budget will bring a lot of things closer to reality. And in fact, proponents of beyond budgeting prefer to use a rolling budget, which tells you that this is the reality we are facing, and therefore this is how we're going to handle matters. So traditional budgeting becomes less relevant when you have a crisis like COVID, but in that case, you could actually adopt it to give you a rolling budget, which says, this is what we're getting, and this is how much we can spend. So in a way, rolling budget will give you a bit of agility. Zero-based budgeting will just make you question the importance of each and every expenditure items.
Okay, thank you, Geoffrey. Of course, we have noted that a lot of SMEs are going through a very difficult time with the pandemic. And we have seen a couple of social enterprises giving soft loans to the SMEs. Other than those loans, what else can we do in terms of supporting the SMEs in be able to take up the challenge and probably even come out stronger than they were after the crisis is over and even during the crisis?
Okay, what I noticed that that question is slightly beyond budgeting, and it is a combination of so many actions, strategic actions that need to be put in place. One is that you may want to consider some of the incentives the government has tried to put in place. That being a very broad measure or strategy that is applicable here. So, for example, now taxes used to be a major expenditure, and with the support from the government, I think recently we moved from a 3% turnover tax to about 1% turnover tax. And that means that if your incomes are slightly dented, then you'll also have a slight saving in terms of tax. So I think that will help you to really manage your cash flows up to that point. And then the next level is that we have various initiatives that are being put in place by various institutions, for example, banks. Banks and other, government-affiliated institutions have put in place mechanisms to cushion SMEs and others in terms of loan moratoriums and holidays. So again, that also minimizes the impact that you'll have on your cash flows. And you may also have, other bodies, the IMF coming in through different entities to support the SME. So I think it's a combination of many activities, both offered at the macro level and also within the some institutions like the banks and other micro finance institutions. And again, given the discussions we've had about how to manage your budgets, things like zero-based budgeting can help you to identify critical expenditures. And then, of course, your strategies and other things that you need to put in place may help a bit. But again, based on the uncertainty we have, you'll also have quite a number of SMEs being affected substantially and significantly, and they have to close shop. But in terms of strategies, I think there are quite a number that can be evaluated.
Thank you so much. We have seen Strathmore University roll out a couple of online trainings, both for the academic programs as well as SME. And I know this is beyond the budgeting cost, but the question is here, how are these online training motivating the SMEs? Because we realize that a lot of SMEs want the face-to-face trainings because of the networking capability of the face-to-face. But what is the role of the online trainings that Strathmore University is giving to SMEs and even to the general public?
All right. I think in terms of capacity building, for us, what COVID has done is just to modify the way we deliver on training SMEs with regards to how to manage their businesses. Of course, being an entrepreneurial based university, I think the idea is capacity building is actually a very important mandate for Strathmore and many other institutions. And I think what COVID has done is just to say, okay, fine. Initially, the idea was to put the learners in workshops where you have a face-to-face. You can do some networking, interaction, case study analysis without the impact of technology. But now what it means is that with COVID, the traditional way of doing things requires to be a bit innovative. And I believe that, given all the support that we have, and some of these, webinars that are done or capacity building that is done, where there are no costs other than maybe having the proper infrastructure, is going a long way to support what the SMEs can do. And given some of the sessions we've held in the past, and probably the ones that we're going to have in the future, I think a webinar will be very essential in terms of continuing to build capacity for our SMEs, and not only SMEs. I believe that everybody else, whether it's an SME or not, stands to gain a lot. So, for example, without this webinar, probably you'll still be doing budgeting the normal way, or the traditional way. But the fact that you can actually have a different approach to budgeting makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a value add there.
Okay, we have another question that we have some businesses where the top line is a bit rigid, such as manufacturing and production. So we are talking about limitations in terms of the plant capacity of the space or the efficiencies of the machinery. What are some of the ways that budgeting approach and process can be made more responsive to the changes that we are experiencing in such a rigid environment?
Okay, so please remember, like I've said here, again, I'll reiterate that a budget does not really, is not a substitute for poor strategy and planning. And if you look at even a manufacturing setup, many manufacturing organizations, their line of emphasis on the way you structure your operations. And I think the issues of capacity, how much capacity, the structure of your operations, the factory layout, the availability of materials, and planning, all this require you to have important plans and, a lot of strategic initiatives. For quite a number of organizations, if you make reference to strategy and operations, there are a number of tactics or strategies that can be adopted to make you be able to cope with the scenarios that you face. A lot of people talk about lean operations, being adoptive, relying a bit on technology for innovation, and of course, again, things like inventory. There's the approach for just in time, if that is applicable. Then you look at how you manage your supply chain of raw materials and products. And of course, also how you schedule work for your staff. So I believe that even during such crises, it is possible for a manufacturing setup to be able to be innovative and adaptive. And of course, remember that we've talked about flexible budget, which requires you to do a budget given various scenarios. So, for example, if a factory thinks that demand for its products can go down to the lowest possible, then the question is of what use can you put your facilities to? So therefore, there are many approaches that strategies that can apply even for manufacturing setup.
Okay, thank you so much. We have a question that's asked, at what point do you rule out the traditional budgets already in place? Because we had budgeted, we had put budgets in place beginning of the year or beginning of the strategy period. So at what point do we put away those traditional budgets and move to either rolling budgets or zero-based budgets, as the challenge of COVID-19 continues to ravage the world and we don't know when the end is coming? So at what point do we give up our old budgets?
Okay, if you look at what we had talked about in terms of the levels of budget, as I mentioned here, Fraser and Hope, the two Harvard professors who are advocating that we don't do the traditional budgeting, we do away with budgeting completely. They have already, confirmed or have been able to do some case studies of organizations that have done away with budgeting completely. But basically, when they checked on the ground, they discover that companies are doing what is called a rolling budget. Now, when you talk about a rolling budget, all these budgets that I've indicated here on the screen doesn't mean that you can do away with them completely. What you're saying is that traditional budgeting no longer becomes your critical budget, because it will still provide you some important historical figures. Remember that you have a strategy, and if you have not changed that strategy, you'll still have to incur certain expenditures and also expect incomes from certain revenue sources. So if, for example, you're Coca-Cola, you know very well that you've done your budget for last year, and you've budgeted the drinks that people will take in terms of sodas and water. And in that case, then you'll still have to continue, or you'll have to manufacture them. So what you're saying is that you'll find the demand for your drinks will go down because a lot of people have lost their jobs. So the critical thing then is move to zero-based budget and ask yourself, so if we are to continue operating at a minimum with reduced demand, what are the critical expenses that we cannot avoid? So every expenditure is justified. So all you're doing is that you may want to rework your costs from scratch up to a certain level and compare with the historical whether they make sense. Or alternatively, what you can then do is that you can take the figures for the first quarter. So for example, if you've done the budget for 2019, look at the data for the first quarter, for example, and that data will now give you an indication of what is coming in the second quarter. So this is basically your rolling budget. Now, just in case you decide to change your strategy a bit and introduce new products that you feel can take care or help you deal with the part of the crisis, then you can then support that with program-based budgeting. So you'll find that in a way, it will depend a lot on the circumstance, but you cannot do away with traditional budgeting completely unless now you change your strategy also. So therefore, it's going to be a long haul. And in fact, the two Harvard professors have actually discovered that despite their preaching, people move away from traditional budgeting to rolling budgets, for example. Many organizations are still at traditional budgeting, trying just to improve them. So that means that we are not able to fully do away with the traditional budgeting, but we can supplement this with other strategies.
Okay. Thank you, Geoffrey. You mentioned earlier on that part of the strategies that the SMEs can take advantage of is being able to take advantage of the reduced turnover tax. Is there a way that we can opt out as SMEs from the turnover tax, or how can we leverage on the amendments to the Tax Act as SMEs?
Okay, so there are there are quite a number of taxes that the government has put in place, or tax incentives that the government has put in place. And I think for SMEs, if you look at the philosophy behind turnover tax, many SMEs ended up paying a lot of tax under the previous regime, where if you make profits, then you end up paying tax. And of course, there was also a bit of a problem because you also had to file returns, you had to have your accounts audited, and also you incur additional costs to paying someone to certify your accounts. But turnover tax is simply as a flat rate on what is coming in, and a lot of SMEs who are campaigning for this discover that turnover tax is much lower than the normal corporate tax of 30% on profits. But again, the success of turnover tax will depend a lot, especially if you're still able to make more incomes. Now, if you have reduced revenues, revenue, the other name is turnover, then you'll find that the tax itself does not help you so much. If your revenues are subdued, so that will mean that you'll have to think about other strategies that you can help to minimize tax. But at the moment, also in terms of trying to also increase the tax base, on the one hand, the government wants the SMEs not to pay a lot of tax, but on the other hand, the government also wants to be able to raise more tax if everybody can be able to pay their tax. So the government does this by simplifying the tax process. So revenue tax, you only need to confirm your revenues or what you've sold, and then you pay, say, the 3%, or now it's 1% of what you've earned. You don't have to file returns about expenditures and profits and many others. Although you can file some of them as just a norm, but this time it will be cheaper for you. So at the moment, I don't think you can avoid turnover tax unless you avoid revenues. And I think why are you in business? You're in business because you want to make revenues. So I think that probably will be a thing. So maybe it's just to accept that it will reduce your exposure to tax somehow in the long term.
Okay, thank you so much, Geoffrey, for an insightful afternoon. We have learned quite a bit regarding budgeting and how we can change our mindset from the traditional budgeting right now that we are faced with the crisis. And we'll definitely put into practice what we have learned, both at corporate level and at SME level. Thank you so much, Geoffrey. We appreciate. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation, for logging on in time and staying on. We really appreciate your time. Again, Strathmore University is rolling out online programs, and we would love to host you in those online programs. So thank you so much. We appreciate. I've been your host, Eda Muni, and I wish you a lovely afternoon and wishing you a very budgeting afternoon. Thank you so much and enjoy yourselves.